Imagine spending your childhood watching your exhausted immigrant parents being tormented by a sadistic neighbor for over 15 years and being powerless to stop it. Now imagine growing up, getting smart, getting evidence, and executing the perfect revenge that destroyed their lives. They were both 45 when I was born, which already made them older than most parents around us, but they were determined to give me every opportunity they never had. My dad was shot in the head in a random act of violence, something that made the evening news for a single day and then disappeared from public memory. But inside the walls of our tiny apartment, he was a storm. It was a 3-family house on the literal edge of town. The other side of our street was government-subsidized housing, which made our little corner cheaper than the rest of the town. Still, it was the best they could afford, and they were hopeful. Maybe here, Dad would mellow out. Maybe here, I could focus on school, and Mom could finally catch her breath. We took the first floor, moving in our second-hand furniture and beat-up belongings, ready to start over. My mom and I walked on eggshells every day, never knowing what would set them off, never knowing when the yelling and chaos would start. The neighborhood was rough around the edges, and our new upstairs neighbor Salman Hudi moved in just months before us turned out to be a nightmare wrapped in a fake smile. We didn't know it then, but moving into that house meant stepping right into the middle of a 15-year-long hellscape that would nearly break us all. Still, at that point, we were hopeful, we were fighters, and we believed, against all the odds, that things would get better. We were wrong. There were times I thought we wouldn't make it to the next day, but somehow, we did. My mom was unbelievably strong. She'd work late shifts, come home exhausted, and still try to keep things normal for me. I remember watching her rinse out our trash and recycling bins out back every month, just to keep something clean, something controlled in the middle of the madness. But we never recovered. He survived, but the bullet left permanent brain damage. Gone was the gentleman I'd heard stories about, replaced by someone who was unpredictable, angry, and violent behind closed doors. It was like a stranger had taken over his body. He couldn't work again, so my mom became the family's sole breadwinner, forced into whatever job she could find, because the U.S. wouldn't recognize her degree. We lived paycheck to paycheck, sometimes struggling even to keep the lights on. My mom had been a college graduate back home, and my dad was the most kind, compassionate man you could imagine, hardworking, affectionate, someone who would give his last dollar to help a neighbor. For a couple of years, things felt like a typical immigrant struggle. Tight finances, long hours, but a house full of love and warmth. That's my story. From a house of chaos and pain to a courtroom victory that forced Karen out of her home and cost her custody of her son. And you see, the kid, this isn't just about payback. It's about justice served cold. Buckle in, because this gets dark, real, and extremely satisfying. I was born in the U.S., the only child of 2 older parents who had immigrated from Venezuela in the 90s, hoping to build a safer, more stable life than the chaos they'd left behind. Then, when I was 10, everything shattered in an instant. My dad, meanwhile, kept it together around strangers. He knew the risk of someone calling the cops and what that could mean. When I was 7, my parents scraped together enough money to buy a place in a small town nearby, hoping for a better school district and maybe, just maybe, a safer environment for me. But the dream of a better life never really materialized. It didn't take long after moving in for us to realize we were living beneath a monster. Her name was Karen. She had this way of smiling to your face, big wide-spake grin, while her eyes stayed cold and calculating. Her husband, Bill, an immigrant himself with poor English, followed her lead in everything. He acted tough when he needed to, puffing out his chest, but at the end of the day, Karen was clearly in charge. And what she wanted, she usually got. If something didn't go her way, she'd find ways to punish you quietly, with just enough plausible deniability that it made you second-guess yourself. That destroyed bin. The walls of our apartment felt like they pulsed with tension. Dad was unpredictable, one moment silent and withdrawn. Karen and Bill were their own storm, throwing trash on our car. Karen and Bill kept being themselves, throwing parties, trashing the property, tossing their trash over the balcony, using our bins, screaming at their kid. It was like we lived in a house built on rotting wood, everything shaky and ready to collapse. And every time Karen pulled something new, slashing our bins, destroying our car windows, my mom would swallow her anger and say, "It's not worth it. We just need peace." But there was no peace. There was only constant, grinding survival, slamming doors, screaming into the night. Inside, Dad's moods were like walking through a minefield. I never knew where the next explosion would come from. And Mom, she was always tired, her face lined with worry, doing her best to keep me safe while juggling bills and jobs and the daily grind. There was no room in her life to pick fights with neighbors. Survival was the priority. The next moment, exploding over something as small as a cup left out on the counter. By the time I was a teenager, I was struggling with depression so deep it felt like my bones were filled with lead. A part of me thought the house would become calmer, but the damage was done. I was left with years of mental scars, and Mom was older, more fragile, more beaten down than ever. I fell into an even darker place for a while, but slowly, painfully, I started to crawl out. I got therapy, I got help, I graduated high school, I got into college, and in the back of my mind a tiny voice started whispering, enough. Enough watching Karen destroy the only stability my mom and I had. Enough letting her walk all over us like trash. I didn't just want revenge, I needed it. I needed it to prove to myself that the world wasn't just a place where bullies got away with everything. I needed it to heal. And one day I promised myself I would make her pay. I'd look out my bedroom window at night and fantasize about not waking up the next day. School became impossible to handle. I was constantly exhausted, constantly scared, and constantly on edge. I wound up dragging myself through high school for 8 years. Twice the usual time, because some days I just couldn't do it. Some days, even getting out of bed felt like climbing Everest with no oxygen. Some nights, the yelling would start over nothing at all, echoing down the hallway, rattling the dishes on the shelves. I learned early on how to shrink myself, how to tiptoe around the apartment, how to make myself invisible. And even then, it wasn't always enough. Could have been kids messing around, the dents in our car. Maybe they just threw trash and didn't mean to hit it. The thing was, Mom and Dad were already dealing with enough shit inside our apartment. Dad's mood swings, money problems, my schooling. They didn't have the energy to fight a neighbor war. And Karen thrived on that. She knew we were vulnerable and she exploited it at every chance. One of the first hints that things weren't right came in the form of our trash bins. Bill never seemed to stand up to her. He did exactly what she told him, even when it meant being cruel or destructive. The pattern never changed. Karen bullied us, trashed our property, stole our peace of mind, and got away with it every single time. Mom would just shrug and say, "We don't want problems, it's not worth it." So we stayed quiet, and Karen grew bolder. She dumped her junk into the shared basement space, blocking our access to the oil tank. She never asked permission, never cleaned up after herself. She didn't need to. She was Karen, the queen of our cursed three-family castle, and nobody dared challenge her throne. Until I got old enough to realize she wasn't invincible and that I had the power to tear her perfect little world apart. I remember hearing them argue about their son when he was just a toddler. Karen would scream that he was too soft, that he'd never be a real man. Bill would say nothing, and little Henry, God, I remember hearing him crying through the thin ceiling. It made my stomach twist. I knew what it felt like to be terrified in your own home. But unlike me, he had two monsters instead of one. My mom was meticulous about them. She'd clean them every month so they wouldn't stink or attract bugs. Karen, apparently, didn't care. One day we noticed her recycling bin had gotten so nasty it practically oozed sludge. Instead of cleaning it, Karen just started using ours. Mom and Dad didn't want to pick a fight, but eventually, after our bin got disgusting, they sent out a polite email asking whoever was using it to stop. We knew it was Karen, but we wanted to keep things civil. Within a week, Karen and Bill had a brand new bin. Our old bin was slashed to ribbons with a knife. Mom found it in pieces out back. We never saw who did it, but come on. We knew that was Karen in a nutshell. Petty, vindictive, and shameless. She'd host loud parties and toss empty bottles and trash right over her balcony, usually smashing into the area near our old Toyota. But Karen made sure to keep her public face intact. Outside she was the friendly neighbor, smiling, waving at passers-by, acting like everything was perfect. Bill would hover behind her, quiet, sullen eyes on the ground, but always ready to jump in if she needed him to back her up. He was like her personal attack dog, obedient, but dangerous when unleashed. Mom and Dad would politely knock on her door and ask her to stop. She'd promise to be more careful, smile, close the door, and do it again the next weekend. We'd hear her and Bill screaming at each other almost every night, doors slamming, glass breaking, sometimes what sounded like furniture being tossed around. I was just a kid, trying to do homework. While this constant chaos thundered above my head, sometimes I'd hear crying Karen yelling at Bill, Bill yelling back, then silence, like someone had left or stormed out. Years later, when their son Henry was born, it didn't stop. If anything, the fights got worse. Karen was a master manipulator. Meanwhile, over the years, growing up, outside our door, the constant chaos seeped into me. All the while, when Dad finally died, college was my turning point. After years of barely hanging on, Mom was getting older. The back porch needed new floorboards. Even Karen and Bill. I watched Karen. She wasn't used to someone pushing back, even gently. They didn't just want to live their lives, they wanted to stomp on everyone else's. Mom wanted to throw it out, but I convinced her to let me put it outside in our designated parking space out back. At the same time, I used the email to bring up something else I'd been waiting on. Karen and Bill's pile of junk in the basement. I told them it was blocking access to her oil tank, that it was a safety hazard, and that according to the condo agreement, they needed to clear the area. I kept the tone civil, respectful, but firm. I gave them a deadline of a few weeks to do it themselves or I'd take care of it. Sure enough, within days, my treadmill was destroyed, sliced 2 ribbons with a knife. They didn't even bother hiding it. I checked the footage from the pantry camera and saw exactly what I needed. Bill standing there with a massive knife, hacking away while Karen pointed and directed him like some twisted orchestra conductor. I told her it would motivate me to use it more fresh air. They didn't just damage our property, they did it on camera, with clear evidence of the weapon, the timing, everything. It was exactly what I needed to prove the pattern of harassment and violence, and by giving them a target they couldn't resist my treadmill, I had turned the tables. For the first time in 15 years, they were the ones caught red, and I was just getting started. She never responded to emails unless it was about money owed to her, and even then, she was dismissive. This was no different. No response, no acknowledgement. But I wasn't surprised. This was exactly what I wanted. Meanwhile, I set up the treadmill in our space and covered it with a tarp. It was placed carefully, tucked to the side, nowhere near blocking anyone else's spot. But I wanted them to notice it. I wanted them to associate it with me, to see it every time they went out back, and to start stewing about it. Nice weather, and used the treadmill sometimes while Karen and Bill were leaving to drive Henry to school. I'd wave, smile, act friendly. So one night at 1 a.m. I went downstairs with a GoPro strapped to my head. I spent over an hour carefully moving every piece of their junk into their designated cubicle in the basement. I packed it like Tetris, floor to ceiling, perfectly organized so not a single inch of space was wasted. It was almost beautiful in its precision, and I filmed the whole thing. No accusations they could twist into something else. I wanted them to see me as confident, present, unafraid. At the same time, I set up a hidden camera in our pantry window facing the back lot. I buried it under clothes in the laundry basket. It had a big SD card and recorded 24/7 times. It was perfectly positioned to catch anything that happened near the treadmill or the back lot. Plus it would free up room in the kitchen. She wasn't thrilled, but she agreed. So if I was going to bring them down, I needed them to reveal exactly who they were. And I needed evidence. That's when the treadmill idea came to me. I could tell. It rattled her. Her smile got tighter, her voice sharper when we crossed paths. But on the surface, she couldn't argue because I was fixing problems, keeping records, making things better. I was doing exactly what a responsible neighbor should do, who usually ignored everything. I started laying the groundwork for something bigger. I asked Mom to dig up old emails, proof of Karen and Bill's bad behavior over the years. I took photos of the junk they piled in front of our oil tank in the basement. I studied the deed to the house, memorized every rule about common areas and condo responsibilities. I began building a paper trail so that when the time came, I wouldn't just have accusations, I'd have receipts, files, pictures, videos. I didn't tell Mom exactly what I was planning. I wanted her to be able to deny everything. Eventually coughed up their share of the money. Karen had bullied us for over a decade because we were vulnerable. Because my dad was sick and my mom was scared. That version of our family was gone. I was an adult now. I had survived everything: Dad's rage, the screaming matches, the depression, the hopeless nights, and I wasn't afraid anymore. Karen was going to learn that we weren't the same easy targets we used to be. And when she fell, I'd make sure the landing was as brutal as possible. The third-floor tenants started seeing me as the point person for condo issues, which was exactly what I wanted. I kept going. I mowed the tiny patch of grass out front, weed-whacked the pavement out back, and on snow days I woke up early to shovel, before anyone else even got out of bed. I didn't complain, didn't boast, I just did the work and sent out receipts. So I bought the wood myself, ripped out the old boards, and nailed the new ones in. It wasn't glamorous, but it was visible. Then I replaced both storm doors, about 6 months apart, again with my own money up front. Each time, I emailed the other units, Karen and Bill on the second floor, and whoever was on the third floor that year, letting them know I had done the work, and that I just wanted everyone to pay their share of the materials when they could. I kept the tone polite, but professional. I didn't ask permission, I just did it. and documented everything in writing. Working less, finally breathing a little after decades of holding everything together, and I knew it was my turn to step up. For the first time, I started paying real attention to the house, the trash bins, the basement, the porch, the constant drip of small maintenance jobs nobody ever wanted to do. That was my opening. I knew that Karen thrived on other people being passive. If someone showed up, started fixing things, started sending emails, started acting like an equal adult, she wouldn't know what to do. I finally found something like stability. Therapy helped. Meds helped. But mostly I learned how to take all the chaos inside me and channel it into something productive. I got scholarships, lots of them. I studied hard, picked up part-time jobs, and slowly rebuilt myself into someone stronger, someone who could look Karen in the eye without flinching. Meanwhile, I started small, and people responded. Meanwhile, in the background, this wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about reclaiming control. I knew Karen and Bill thrived on control. We had this old treadmill sitting in our kitchen, taking up way too much space. Before I moved the treadmill, I sent out an email to Karen, Bill, and the third-floor tenants, letting them know I'd be placing it in our space, and asking if anyone had concerns about maneuvering their cars. I knew Karen. I also changed my routine. Every morning I went out. Weeks passed. Nothing. Karen and Bill didn't clear the basement. They ignored my email. I didn't sleep that night. I was too excited, too wired from adrenaline. They had taken the bait perfectly. The night I moved Karen and Bill's junk out of the basement common area felt like a dark, thrilling ritual. I waited until the house was dead silent. 1 a.m., the hour where even Karen seemed to sleep. One by one, I carried every piece into their designated basement cubicle. It took over an hour and a half, but by the end, I had transformed the mountain of junk into something almost beautiful. A giant, solid block of organized chaos, floor to ceiling, perfectly stacked so not a single inch was wasted. My mild OCD took over and it became a personal art project. Everything fit together like puzzle pieces. Then called the police. Karen and Bill weren't allowed to come within a certain distance of us or our property. I also handed over the recordings I'd collected of them screaming at Henry through the ceiling. I didn't know what the Department of Children and Families would do with audio alone, but I wanted them on the radar. The cop I worked with was sympathetic. Mom and I sat in the small, stale interview room at the precinct, while the officer reviewed our mountain of evidence. There were old emails documenting years of petty harassment, photos of the knife-top trash bin from when I was a kid, videos of Karen's junk piled in front of our oil tank, GoPro footage showing me carefully moving their junk without breaking a single thing. And now the Crown Julia clear, time-stamped video of Bill destroying our treadmill while Karen directed him. He said he'd forward everything to the appropriate channels. The restraining order was extended years. They put the house up for sale, load boxes into trucks, and quietly apologized to me and Mom whenever we passed in the hall. The house felt different. They were the ones forced to run, forced to hide, forced to rely on others to clean up their mess while they watched helplessly. And that was only the beginning of their downfall. Quieter, safer, I'd walk through the halls and not feel my shoulders tense at every footstep above. Mom started sleeping better. The nightmares faded, bit by bit. And for the first time in my life, I felt like we owned this place. Like we weren't just clinging on by our fingernails while someone else terrorized us. They were almost embarrassed, like they'd seen this pattern before and were tired of covering for Karen and Bill's toxic bullshit. The relatives never caused problems. They were polite, quick, and gone as soon as the job was done. But selling a property you legally can't visit. They couldn't negotiate or wait for a better deal. They needed out fast, needed the money, needed to move on to wherever they were going next. Part of me wanted to gloat, to throw a party out back and toast their misery. But I didn't. I just kept moving forward, kept living. Because at the end of the day, the best revenge wasn't just driving them out, it was showing that we'd survived them, that we were stronger than they ever imagined, and that they couldn't break us no matter how hard they tried. That's a nightmare. Their realtor had to handle everything. For once, they weren't the ones pulling strings. They were ghosts in their own downfall, forced to watch from the outside while someone else cleaned up their mess. Not months. Karen and Bill were effectively banned from their own home. They couldn't set foot on the property without risking arrest. That meant they couldn't pick up their mail, couldn't get their belongings, couldn't even see the house except from the street. "You've got them dead to rights," he finally said. They couldn't come within a certain distance of us, and since we shared a house, that effectively meant they couldn't step foot on the property. The police notified them immediately. I wasn't there to see it. I heard from a third-floor neighbor that they came home, saw the cruiser parked out front, and started yelling at the cops before they were served with paperwork. Then they left. and they never came back. We'll file this as destruction of property intimidation, and we can push for a temporary restraining order today. That meant they couldn't legally enter the house they owned at least until a court hearing. I made sure to turn over the basement footage to prove I hadn't damaged anything in case they tried to claim otherwise. But now the law was on our side. Now there was no ignoring it, no playing dumb, no smirking behind a closed door. Every interaction was documented. Every conversation was in writing, and I had enough evidence to back them into a legal corner they couldn't escape. They did exactly that. They tried to fight it, claiming we were harassing them, that I had damaged their property in the basement. But the GoPro footage shut that down immediately. It showed me moving their junk carefully, stacking it neatly in their own designated space, not damaging anything. Meanwhile, their only defense against the treadmill video was sputtering denial, even though it showed Bill's face clearly, knife in hand, cutting up the machine while Karen watched, accusing me of breaking their property when I moved it. But the GoPro footage shut that down immediately. I reported the destruction of property, told them about years of harassment. Then too, they were the ones exiled from their own home. And the best part, they had no idea the extent of the trap they'd fallen into. Every step documented, every lie dismantled, every move they made already anticipated by me. The scared kid they thought would never grow up to fight back. Karen and Bill weren't allowed back. They tried to fight the restraining order, but we had ironclad evidence and their petty destruction spree on video. The judge extended it. They couldn't come back home. They couldn't even retrieve their things. Their realtor became their proxy, showing the house to potential buyers. Their family came to pack up their junk, handed over my meticulously organized folder of evidence emails, photos, GoPro footage of the basement cleanup, and now this new video of them committing vandalism with a weapon. I told them my mother and I feared for our safety, and we wanted a restraining order immediately. The responding officer didn't even question it once he saw the footage. He helped us file everything the same day. From the side, you could see a clear path by the door to get to either wall, but otherwise it was packed tight, immovable. I filmed the whole thing, time-stamped, clear proof that I hadn't broken or damaged a single item. I strapped a GoPro to my forehead, turned on the basement lights, and opened the door to their disaster pot. Years of pent-up frustration and fear and helplessness turned into a sculpted monument to pettiness and precision. That night, I barely slept. I was too wired, too excited for the next step. It was huge boxes, old furniture, broken appliances, scraps of wood and cardboard stacked precariously in front of our oil tank. A fire hazard, a violation of the condo rules, and just another symbol of how Karen felt untouchable. The tarp had been ripped away, the console screen shattered, the frame slashed and gouged with deep knife cuts. I didn't even feel mad. I felt relief, like the final piece of the puzzle had clicked into place. I went straight to the camera hidden in the pantry laundry basket and pulled the SD card. There it was, crystal clear footage of Bill holding a massive knife, hacking away at the treadmill while Karen stood beside him, pointing, directing him like some twisted puppet master. Their voices were faint but audible. Karen's higher, urgent commands. Bill's muttered curses as he guarded the machine. I took my time, careful not to make noise. I remember standing there, sweaty and grinning like an idiot, just admiring my handiwork. It didn't take long for Karen and Bill to notice. I was in tea there when they first discovered the basement, probably at work or class, but Mom said she heard them stomping around upstairs, voices low and tense, the floorboards creaking under Bill's heavy footsteps. I timed my treadmill use differently that week, staying away from the back lot whenever they were around. I wanted them to simmer, to stew, to build up all their rage and focus it on the one thing they could easily reach, the treadmill. Sure enough, within days, they struck. I came home one afternoon and found it torn to pieces. I backed up the footage in 3 places. The temporary restraining order went through fast. Meanwhile, a week passed. After 15 years of terrorizing us, once the police had the footage of Bill carving up our treadmill with a knife, things moved fast. The officer barely looked up as he processed everything. He just kept nodding, making notes, occasionally glancing at the screen and shaking his head. Within hours, a judge granted the temporary restraining order against both Karen and Bill. For years, Karen had bullied us in the shadows, using plausible deniability and threats of escalation to keep us quiet. A week later, we petitioned the court to extend the restraining order. The judge sided with us. After another week of living out of hotels or maybe with relatives, their relatives showed up in shifts to pack their things. I heard from the third-floor neighbor that Karen and Bill had to sell at a loss. After they were gone, Karen and Bill had spent 15 years trying to make us feel small, powerless, scared. In the end, Even before I set my plan in motion, I'd been quietly collecting audio recordings whenever Karen and Bill took out their rage on Henry. Their voices cut through our thin ceiling, Corinne's shrieking fury, Bill's deep rumble, the sickening thud of something hitting the floor, and worst of all, Henry's sobs. Part of me feared it wouldn't be enough. Part of me hoped maybe someone would finally protect that boy the way no one had protected me. DCF opened a case almost immediately. They'd already heard of Karen and Bill before. Apparently someone had filed an anonymous tip years ago that never went anywhere, and I reminded myself, they did this. But wherever he is, I hope he's better off than he was. Karen had always bragged about her job as a school guidance counselor in a nearby town, talked about how much she helped kids, like she was some kind of hero. Part of me wanted to know if the fallout from our restraining order and the DCF investigation had followed her there, and I hope someday he learns that someone downstairs heard him crying and did anything to try and help. The secretary didn't hesitate, she said, flat and matter of fact, "I'm sorry. That staff member is no longer employed here." Karen thought she was untouchable, until her past caught up with her in a tidal wave of truth and karma. Her family gone, her job lost, her house sold under pressure. This wasn't petty revenge. This was justice, and I gotta protect a kid like me in the process. If this story hit you in the gut, hit that like button. Subscribe for more real revenge stories that prove the long game always wins. That was it. No explanation. No redirect to another extension. Just gone. They were the monsters, not me. I didn't break Henry's toys, didn't shatter his sense of safety, didn't teach him to fear the people who were supposed to love him. Karen and Bill chose their path. I just forced them into the light, where their masks slipped and the world finally saw the truth. But now, combined with the police report and the restraining order, they couldn't ignore it. This wasn't just about us anymore. It was about every kid she might have bullied or hurt at that school. Every family she might have lied to with that smug grin. For the first time, Karen was stripped of her power, her authority, her mask, and if even one kid was safer because of what I did, that was the best revenge of all. I never wanted to exploit their kids' pain, but I couldn't just sit. Karen and Bill were furious, stressed, lashing out at everyone, including Henry. DCF was already sniffing around, visiting the property, asking questions. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe Karen resigned or left on her own. But in my gut, I knew the timing wasn't random. Word had probably gotten around about DCF, about the restraining order, maybe even about the audio recordings of her screaming at her kid. So when Karen and Bill cracked under pressure, ramping up the abuse in front of the wrong people, the state stepped in. Henry was taken away, not immediately, but within weeks. The relatives didn't say much about where he went, just that Karen and Bill were fighting tooth and nail to get him back and losing badly. And listen, powerless, like I had with my own father. I needed proof, so I recorded everything. When I handed those recordings over to the police with the rest of my evidence, I wasn't sure what would happen. I heard from one of Karen's relatives, while they were packing boxes, that things got worse upstairs after the treadmill incident. When I heard that news, I felt complicated. On one hand, I was relieved. Henry didn't deserve the hell he'd been living through. No kid does. But I also felt guilty, like maybe my revenge had poured gasoline on the fire, pushed Karen and Bill into a corner where they took it out on Henry even more viciously. I hated myself for that thought, for the voice in the back of my head whispering, "Maybe you made it worse." But then I remembered the night I lay awake, listening to Karen scream at Henry, listening to him sob, knowing exactly how that terror felt. In the end, I hope Henry ended up with one of those apologetic relatives, someone who would actually care for him. I'll never know for sure. A few months after Karen and Bill vanished from our lives, I got curious. So I asked a friend to make a quick call to the school, posing as a parent looking to speak with Karen. I did a little digging online and saw they brought in a new guidance counselor at the start of the school year, right around when Karen and Bill lost custody of Henry. It was sweet, poetic justice. To anyone who's ever watched bullies destroy good people and felt powerless, know this time, patience and receipts are your best weapons.